much, Jody, and perfect. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to kind of spend a few minutes with us. And I'm hoping that this will be as fruitful for you as it's often for me. And before I share my slides, just a couple of quick highlights as to how to think about our discussion today. First, this is a discussion, and a lot of the things we're going to be talking about are things that, as much as academics think about and write about, several people off the street often have some thought or idea about the general topics we're going to be discussing. So with that in mind, please feel free to kind of, once we're done during the Q&A session, to push back, to prod, to build up on the process. So that's one. Two, at some point we'll kind of do break rooms, and the idea behind those breakout rooms is to give you folks a sense of what media in African countries in 1994 looked like. All right, so you get to see not just the coverage of Rwanda, but also who was saying what. And we're going to be focusing on Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa. And then there's also information about a much more recent case. And the reason I do this often is for folks to get a sense of what I'm talking about, but also very, very importantly, actually see the media, right? And see what it looked like, and see, the ink stains on the piece of paper, because that kind of gives a much more tactile appreciation of some of the things we're talking about. So without further ado, I will share my slides. Let's see if this works the way I think it should work. Can everybody kind of see my slides? Perfect. I am using an editorial cartoon about Darfur and Sudan, and I realize this, and I often do this on purpose, because the images coming out of Rwanda at this particular time, even the editorial cartoons, were sort of uniquely graphic. So I try to save people from that, but also, the things we talk about today vis-a-vis media analysis are things that we could transfer to any other conflicts, not just across the continent, but around the world. And you're able to, the skills you get, right, you're able to transfer them to different scenarios. And this is why I often use this particular editorial cartoon about Darfur when I speak about Rwanda. And as a matter of principle, I'd like us to all begin from the same standpoint, right? And the standpoint is what I understand as genocide, and the definition of genocide that I'm going to use. This particular definition comes from the Genocide Convention. And there are a few things I want us to notice really quickly before we dive into anything else. A, as you, obviously, most of you know this by now, there are no numbers discussed at the Genocide Convention. B, the issue of an intent to destroy is often very important in this conversation. And the groups that are defined by the convention as being likely victims of genocide, as was imagined when the time this was being written and voted upon, is a very small specific group of people, right? And in your classes, you'll often get a question about, well, what about this group and this group? The challenge is, because they don't necessarily work within the groups that the convention give us, it becomes a difficult conversation to have about the culpability of genocide in the criminal sense, right? So often when we speak about genocide, I feel as though we have to have a split mind, right? The one that focuses on the convention and the way the convention defines it, and genocide as it's used much more colloquially. And those two particular tracks lead to very different results sometimes. So the definition I use throughout this particular talk is this one that is laid out in the convention. But very quickly, we see a couple of conundrums, right? A, in the heat of an atrocity unfolding and everybody wanting to label it a genocide, the question that we often have to ask, and the question that, in my experience, journalists are sort of wrestling with, is how do you show intent, right? Because intent is a very specific criminal term. And in my experience, when you speak to journalists, they're like, well, it's not for me to decide whether something that is happening is genocide or not. My job is to cover it. Now, if a legal institution or if an international institution defines it as genocide, then I will use that to kind of speak about the conflict. This was a response I had a lot about when I was doing my research on Darfur and speaking to African journalists that had covered Darfur. And my former advisor is somewhere here, Professor Sabelsberg. And one of the things he has done and looked at is often the relationship sometimes between the judicial sector and the diplomatic sector and news organizations, right? How do they borrow from each other's language to define an event, but also how do they inform each other in how to talk about certain events? So that's the first conundrum, right? The conundrum of intent, and how do you do that as a journalist who's just landed in the middle of conflict in a country that sometimes you don't even know? The second bit is the part of the definition that talks about in part, and the meaning of that in the convention when they say to destroy a group in whole or in part. What does the in part mean? And how do we kind of wrestle with this? So that's kind of the second conundrum that we're trying to figure out. At least I'm trying to figure out in my work when I talk about media and genocides on the continent. Article 6 of the convention says that individuals that have been accused of genocide will be tried by a competent tribunal, right? And if you ask a lot of Africans, the consternation with this is who establishes or defines competence becomes a matter that is of importance, right? So in the Rwanda case, we had the ICTR in Arusha. In the Darfur case, part of what we saw was, as much as everybody kept on saying, well, what is happening in Darfur? Is it a genocide or crimes against humanity? There was a debate, at least amongst the journalists I talked to, about where the perpetrators would be prosecuted, right? So should we ship the perpetrators to a court in Europe, i.e. the ICC, or should an independent tribunal be established in much the same way as the ICTR was established for Rwanda within the continent to kind of prosecute state perpetrators? And these are often the tensions that journalists are sort of engaging in, both when they're covering the event, but also post-conflict, right? When they're trying to figure out, okay, so who do we think of as being culpable of this? But also, what do we do with them? And where do we prosecute them, right? So these are real live debates that journalists are having on the ground when they're thinking about these events. And we kind of saw that as well in Rwanda, right? Once we figured out, okay, this is a genocide and this is how it is labeled in the press, the next question was, okay, so who are we prosecuting and where are we prosecuting them, right? And there was a huge debate as to whether the perpetrators should be prosecuted in a European court, or whether they should be, or a tribunal should be set up in the continent, right? Eventually, as we know, the tribunal is set up in Tanzania. So why media, right? And why is analyzing the media and understanding the media's role in this that much more important? For a couple of things, right? So news organizations generally often construct what you can think of as an us versus them mentality, right? So this is us, and this is the things that we do, and this is how we understand the world, and that is them, and that is how they understand the world. So this leads to audiences to think about the rest of the world as fitting within a jigsaw puzzle, right? So who are our friends, who are our enemies, and how are we going to treat them? So when a conflict shows up in an African country, there are a few things you'll often hear. One will be, is this as bad as Rwanda or is it not, right? So is this going to be a genocide like Rwanda was or is it not? But also very quickly, what media organizations tend to do, they, in that particular process, go, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, and our job is to support the good guys and just as the bad guys, right? And this has led to a lot of problems. This has led to a lot of problems with regard to how audiences understand the rest of the world. So think about how your understanding of a conflict in Africa is shaped, right? So there's often this generalized appreciation of, well, these are the perpetrators and these are the people that we need to do something about. And then we need to go save the victims, right? There's this sense of a clear demarcation of who's who. But also the news does something else. It kind of tells us how to think about events through a very subjective process, right? So for example, when a conflict is unfolding, who are the people that are being used as a source? So if a news organization such as the New York Times is telling the story about a conflict in Central African Republic, right? There are a few things you'll quickly realize. Most of the people they'll talk to are more often than not going to be women, right? And they're going to be children. Why? Because there's an understanding amongst society, amongst American society, that women and children are the most vulnerable, right? But the question then becomes that we kind of have to figure out how to wrestle with is it as simple as that, right? To do these subjective processes of selecting what to cover, selecting who to quote, selecting which words to use, is that all it takes to kind of not force seems like a weird way, but to coerce your readers to take a very specific approach about thing X. Think about debates today in the US about COVID vaccines, right? Who talks about COVID in what way, or often ends up affecting what their audiences think about, not just COVID, but also vaccines, right? What should we do? Should we take this vaccine? Should we take the other vaccine? Should we not take vaccines, right? All of that is discussed by media organizations through a very subjective process. As much as we want to think of news coverage and news construction as a purely objective process. So in all of this, what we end up realizing is that news organizations then act as meaning producers, right? So they define what is normal, or they define what is abhorrent, and they define what is ipso facto abnormal and what we should like, right? And those are kind of the dyes. So what then ends up happening is our reality about who we are as a group of people, right, is heavily dependent on how who we are as a group of people is defined and how we take those definitions from the press, which then means who we are as a people requires a level of boundary making, right? So, you know, you'll hear a politician say, something along the lines of, this is not who we are as Americans, right? Well, who are Americans and what is the boundary that define who's an American, who isn't? But what also does it mean to say, this is not who we are, right? Is there a generalized understanding of who we are? By and large, yes, right? Ask an American off the street and they'll go, no, this is what we do as Americans and this is how we approach life, right? So that's what I mean by these providing normative boundaries of how we understand society and how we understand our reality. So all of this then leads us to a couple of things. One, what research continually shows us is that journalists as individuals often define and redefine, constitute and reconstitute phenomena, right? So when we think of the early 1990s, late 1980s US media landscape, think about the conversation about drugs, right? This idea of who was likely to be a drug dealer, who was likely to be a drug victim, and what the state need to do were events that were culturally constructed within these media spaces. Fast forward to 3-4 years ago, where the conversation about drugs, especially opiate addiction, is less about a moral failing of the victim, right? And more about this is a public health catastrophe. So very quickly, we see this radical shift in understandings of what drugs were and what drugs did. It moves from a moral failing to a public health catastrophe that we need to figure out what to do with, right? And this is what I mean by journalists end up employing narratives that organize and present a reality for the audience. Our reality today about our interaction with drugs, especially opiate addiction, is very different from what it looked like in the 80s and 90s. Think about HIV and AIDS cases in the US, right? But another thing is important when you think about journalists, because journalists end up kind of redefining this notion of, like I said, what it means to be American, right? What it means to be American is a very, very vague term. But what journalists do and what the news does quite often, it reinforces certain things about being American, right? So you may watch the news at 6 o'clock. I say this immediately realizing I may be in a very small bracket of people that watches the 6 o'clock news, but at the 6 o'clock news, there's this always a happy-go-lucky story, a story about pluck and hard work, right? Look at this person that did this thing against all the odds. This is what it means to be American, right? It means we pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, right? Those types of things that are sort of vague because Americanness doesn't mean that much, right? In and of itself, are kind of given very concrete meanings and boundaries and understandings through the work of news media, through the work of journalists. So in the picture that I have on this particular slide, right, this is a newspaper in Kenya the day after the former president wins the election, right? And suddenly, for a lot of non-Americans, what it meant to be American changed very drastically. And we saw that play out in how not just the election was covered, but how the election's aftermath was covered. And we see this shift show up again during the insurrection in January, where again, what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be an American democracy outside the US changes drastically. And the role of the US in this particular space that we think of as democratic governance, right, shifts radically. And for a lot of people who've never been to the US, who will never be to the US, their consumption of this notion of Americanness and what America does is through artifacts such as newspapers. And it is for these reasons that sort of thinking through what the media does and why it's important to study it becomes important, right? Because they're contemporaneously not just covering history, but creating an archive, a very physical archive of what it meant to be American, for example, in 2016, right? Versus what it meant to be American in 2007, 2008. And you can kind of trace a country's ebbs and flows through the work of journalists across time. Now, how does this then play out in how we can think about teaching students about the genocide in Rwanda, right? What happened there? Who do we need to sort of think about? What sort of spaces do we need to get that material, right? And just as a quick snapshot, this is how you can think of Rwanda, right? Tiny country in the middle of Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, to the west, Uganda to the north, Burundi to the south, Tanzania to the east, right? And it's a very tiny country. So how then do we teach students about this country and what happened in this country in the mid-1990s? I will start by saying I am uniquely opposed to using fictional works when it comes to genocide. And here, I mean, very specifically, instances such as Hotel Rwanda, right? This Hollywood narration of what happened in an African country, what happens in an African country, for a couple of reasons, right? Fictional works are often highly stylized and creates this perception of a hero, a singular person who does the right thing against all odds, right? This person who embodies what it means to be human. And the reason I say that I'm often opposed to this is because in those moments, right, such as in the case of Hotel Rwanda, for example, in those moments, there's a very specific Americanized understanding of what a hero should look like, right? What a hero should do, what an individual in their own capacity as an individual did, all right, and why we need to celebrate those things. Because it, and it also does this thing where it erases the amount of work a lot of people had to put in when quite literally the world had ignored them. And by the world, I mean Western Europe and the US had ignored them, and North America, sorry, had ignored them, right? And it embraces the experiences of a multitude of people. So I often tell folks, might as well use non-fictional works when it comes to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. Even better if you can get your hands on primary sources, such as news coverage from the region. Here I use the example of Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, because those are sort of those are the news articles that we'll kind of be dealing with today. But those kind of provide a contemporaneous coverage of how the rest of the continent was dealing with this unfolding atrocity. But there are also video testaments from the Shoah Foundation out at University of Southern California. They much recently, added an archive of witness and survivor testimony from Rwanda. Right, so you get to listen to firsthand experiences, but also for students, it reminds them that a lot of these things that we talk about, while they may have happened in the 90s, way before they were born, right? But that it involved people, and it involved people with lives and ambitions and plans and hopes and dreams, right? It places faces to events, because often there's a risk of not imagining genocide victims as human beings, because it seems like such a long way off. And, the more time passes, the more likely this is to happen. And this is why I love using these testimonies, because students can listen and hear and watch, right? To watch the bodily reactions to these particular memories. And Rwanda, the Concord University and the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies has archived transcripts of RTLM radio transcripts during the genocide. A few months, and I think a year before the genocide and during the genocide. While most of them are in Kenya, Rwanda, you've got some English translations. There used to be a website called Rwanda File that had all of these transcripts translated into English, but that is no longer the case. I think the website for some reason just disappeared, and I don't know how to get that stuff. And now most of that particular English translation is held in Rwanda with the Research Institute. I think the acronym is CNLG. And I suspect you may be able to find some of them at the Genocide Archive of Rwanda, which is hosted by the Kigali Genocide Memorial, right? So when you're thinking about Rwanda, I think these are very quick ways to just get not just the voices of the people from the Shoah Foundation, but the texture of the media coverage, both within Rwanda through RTLM and from the region, such as Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa. I have these news articles from these three countries, and I'm currently in the middle of working on them. So what I'll end up doing to allow you folks to have access to it, I think around December, I'll hand them over to the center, and the center will have like just an archive of these things that you folks can kind of dip into and use in your classes and your class prep. The benefits of doing such a media analysis is the multiple. For example, I'm going to focus on just three. One is they kind of show the complexity of language. So one of the things that you often hear when people talk about how Rwanda was covered is they often say, well, the West kind of use stereotypes to talk about the genocide. And they go, so what stereotypes? And they go, yeah, they called it an ethnic conflict, and that has all of these other connotations. That is true. But what you will find in the newspapers in the countries that I'm talking about here, in Kenya and in Rwanda, not Kenya and Rwanda, sorry, in Kenya and in Nigeria mostly, and parts of South Africa as well. But in Kenya and South Africa, the same language was used, right? This language of an ethnic conflict or a tribal hatred was used in the 90s. So for students, this does a couple of things. One, it forces them to think about how do we think through the use of ethnic conflict or tribal hatred. Does it make a difference if it's used by the New York Times versus the Daily Nation in Kenya, right? And if it does, what is the difference and why should we take that difference into account, right? This is what I mean by complexity of language. When you look at the RTLM transcripts, I have a few snippets of them, so I'll show you here. When you look at those transcripts, what we see, especially in the coverage in the period right after the plane crash, so in April and the first week of May, the period that is often thought about as a high genocide period, right? What we see in that particular time frame is the language is not as vitriolic as we may imagine it to be, right? And that then forces us to ask questions about what do we actually know about RTLM as a radio station, but also why is the language not as vitriolic as we may have imagined it, right? And the thing that I often tell people is there's a song and dance that is happening in these transcripts that you kind of have to know the context within which certain words are being used to understand why it is that terrible and it is something that we need to worry about. But the best thing about using media in the way we're about to use it and in the way we're talking about today is those skills are transferable in non-genocide context. So one of the things that we've kind of had to deal with post 2016 in the US is this idea of misinformation and disinformation, right? And it is the idea of these news organizations kind of having a polarizing effect. Taking the skills you learn from doing a media analysis of genocide in Rwanda, those very same skills as to who's talking, what are they saying, who's being quoted, what is the language being used, those very same skills can be transposed onto a post-2016 American media landscape, right? And we can and students can kind of use those skills to think through, well, often we blame online platforms for misinformation in the US. Research is telling us that actually some of the biggest culprits were the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, your mainstream press. So students can then go to these news organizations and see how they covered the two main candidates during the campaign period. What is the language that was used, right? What are the people that were quoted? But also, how do bad actors manipulate journalistic norms such as getting both sides of the story? How does that benefit the perpetrator to the detriment of the victim, right? Or in another way to think about it, how does it allow us to allow misogynistic and racist ideas to spread through mainstream news organizations without actually holding them to account, right? And that's the beauty of these skills is we could use them somewhere else. But there's also something else I'd like us to think about when we think about this. The media landscape, I have vibrant on this slide with the question mark because I've been unable to find a much more appropriate one. But the media landscape in Rwanda pre-genocide was one that was steeped in notions of propaganda, right? Notions of propaganda that had been around since independence, but especially since the Cold War specifically, right? This idea of creating an enemy and who is an enemy and how does this operate, right? So this was part of a very long tradition of propaganda that was then leveraged in very specific ways in Rwanda because of the very specific contextual realities. But also, as much as everybody often focuses on RTLM, right? And this idea of a society that has a lot of, or a media ecology that has a lot of media organizations, right? And a lot of actors that are willing to shine the spotlight on what we think of as truth, is a society that is much more likely to be in some way, shape, or form democratic. Rwanda had 32 privately owned newspapers before the genocide, 32, right? So remember when I was speaking about language, RTLM didn't need to be as vitriolic as we imagine it to have needed to be, because it knew very well that that part of these 32 newspapers would have been doing the work for it and had been doing that work of being vitriolic, right? So there was this, for lack of a better phrase, there's this echo chamber that was created in Rwanda, right? Between that involved key players that were engaged in very, very sophisticated but also simplistic propaganda techniques to marginalize a group of people, right? And those a very specific campaign against Tutsis. So what we have now come to think of as misinformation and disinformation campaigns in the US, these things were unfolding in Rwanda. But also, like I say, they're part of a very long tradition of propaganda, right? So colonial stories about the American West and the South, this notion of the American West and the South having hillbillies, right? And coal miners and people who were not highly educated. This idea of, the history of liberal arts colleges. Why do liberal arts colleges come to be in the US? Liberal arts colleges come to be in the US because we need to educate those savages, right? So that they can gain an education just enough to work for us people out on the coast, right? There's stories about Africa by colonialists, right? There's people, Henry Morton Stanley saying they're running around in abashed nudity, right? Can you imagine if only we civilized them to wear clothes? What would that do, not just for business for us, but for the kind of godly work we would be doing? Or VOA transmissions into Africa during the Cold War, right? This is all part of a long history of propaganda that these news organizations and the radio organizations had been engaged in a while, for a very long time, but had located it within the context of Rwanda, right? And that is what makes it unique. Not that they were vitriolic, because everybody was doing that on the continent, but how they did it how they used it and leveraged it against the Tutsis. So why is our understanding of this particular ecology through the lens of propaganda necessary? I use this slide of propaganda that I got from Jody that she was kind enough to share. But I want you to focus on the purple squares, right? This idea that propaganda plays on emotions and it uses a variety of media to kind of get its point across, right? This idea of an echo chamber showing up at the same time and bombarding people. But also, propaganda works with our conscious and unconscious hopes, fears, and desires. What is happening in Rwanda right before the genocide is the global commodities market tanks and the price of coffee falls off a cliff. Rwanda was heavily agricultural, and the main produce they had been going at this particular time had been coffee for export. So once that happens, incomes shrink, and suddenly there is this turn to your incomes are shrinking because Tutsis are stealing it, right? And the government that was uniquely corrupt suddenly represents itself as almost needing to be corrupt so as to satisfy the Tutsis, because the Tutsis are making them do terrible things, right? So it latches on these hopes and fears and desires, right? And then leads to, once there's a plane crash, it is very easy to ignite that. But it's easy to ignite that because, remember, there were multiple newspapers operating in Rwanda as well, and there were multiple radio stations. So there's a cacophony of hate that is showing up in these particular places that leads to a potent mix of both unique hatred against the Tutsis, but also fear, right? Not just by Tutsis, but of Tutsis as well. And all of these things are playing into this particular space, and you can often see it show up in the media narrative, right? So this is why it's important to kind of look at media, because you can see this turn play out in very distinct ways at very distinct periods. So I will show you the language from an RTLM broadcast. And I want you to focus on the parts highlighted in green, right? Where in the first one, it says, everybody would be happy for having participated in rebuilding their country, and God will help us with that. Go on fighting for peace and have a long life, right? In this particular regard, there's nothing ostensibly saying, kill them all. But this notion of rebuilding of the country stems from the coffee prices falling and this idea of the economy falling off a cliff, right? But RTLM doesn't have to repeat that. right? Because everybody knows this, because the other newspapers that are against the Tutsis are already saying this. And they're using comic strips, and they're using images, and they're using all sorts of things, right? So this notion of rebuilding their country is very specific. And calling on to God is a very specific tactic, right? It's this, you could do terrible things, but God will be on your side and all will be forgiven. In the next except it's to all youths of the parties and all the volunteers who are at roadblocks and who are working. This notion of working becomes very important during the genocide, because killing is discussed and framed as doing work, specifically doing farm work, right? And farm work is often very hard. But again, as you can see, RTLM doesn't have to be that vitriolic in its coverage. The issue often is we tend to focus so much on RTLM, we forget that RTLM was relying on the other publications to kind of sometimes do the dirty work, and they didn't need to do it, right? The challenge then becomes, how do we explain it? And one of my colleagues from Minnesota and I are sort of working on such a project to kind of explain what we think may be happening and why we need to sort of reframe not just our analytical understanding of this particular radio station, but also just a colloquial discussion about radio in Africa, right? This notion that Africans listen to the radio and then wake up one Monday morning and machete everyone. It's kind of ridiculous, right? Because think about anti-vaxxers in the US. They're not just getting messages for the people specifically ideologically opposed to vaccinations, right? They're not just getting their messages from one outlet. They're getting a message from an outlet that is reinforced by other people and other news outlets, right? And that does the job for them. And that's what we're kind of arguing happened in Rwanda. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna do a short media exercise that kind of gives you a tactile way to deal with this. And I suspect Joe will help us send people to breakout rooms. But when you're looking at these newspapers, a couple of things I want you to kind of focus on. Who is credited as having filed the story? So whose name actually shows up, right? If it's an African newspaper, is the journalist African or from somewhere else? What language and tone is used to talk about both either the violence or Rwandans or foreigners fleeing Rwanda or actions by the international community, right? This question of language and tone is what's called framing, right? So how are these things framed by the news organization? Are there any sources quoted? And if there are sources quoted, who's being given a platform? The idea here is to think about who is helping the journalists construct this story about the genocide in Rwanda as it's unfolding. But the key thing also is, does the story give the reader a sense of contextual history? Is there contextualization that these African journalists are engaging in that we can say, oh yeah, this kind of allows us to understand what conflict is sort of unfolding, right? So we're gonna send it to breakout rooms. The one thing I want to mention is, consider this a trigger warning. There's a story, there are two stories in there from Kenya and from the UK that use the same image from Reuters. And the image is of dead Rwandans just on the street. So that may be something that may be traumatizing to some of you. So keep an eye out for those particular stories as we move to breakout rooms. What I will do here is stop sharing my screen for now. And then Joe, how are we doing breakout rooms?
Yeah, so I'll create 4